former Prime Minister Liz Truss.
Great to be on the show, Harry.
Tell us all about it. 10 years to save the West. What are we saving the West from? Not
What we're saving the West from, what we're saving the West from is defeat. Yeah, I am worried that with the current trajectory, we are losing the war or losing the battle against authoritarian regimes, but also in our own countries, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, we're facing increasing takeover by left-wing ideas, whether that's extreme environmentalism, extreme wokery, socialism on the economy. You know, this is the danger, I think, and I think we're losing touch with what we should be about and what our way of life should be about.
Is this a reflection of what you learnt from your experience in government, a long time in government and then a short time at the top of government, or is this a sort of wider manifesto for another look at it?
Well, it is about what I learnt during my time as an MP in government and the forces that we faced.
The deep state you mentioned.
Well, you can call it the deep state, you can call it the quangocracy, you can call it the administrative state. But I think what's happened in Britain is that power that used to be in the hands of democratically elected politicians now lies in the hands of unelected bureaucrats, whether that's the Bank of England, whether it's the Office of Budget Responsibility, whether it's Natural England, the Environment Agency, or even the Post Office. You can see that too often decisions aren't being made by elected politicians who do, for all their faults, get voted in and out by actual voters.
You must have 14 years and the Tories have been in power. Whose fault is that the balance has shifted away? Surely the people in charge are as to blame for that as the mysterious people that you say are colluding against elected politicians.
I do think that we are partly to blame, absolutely. And certainly when I came in as a new MP back in 2010, I don't think I realised the extent to which the Blair government had actually changed where power lay.
Through for example, the Human Rights Act.
The Human Rights Act, but also things like the Constitutional Reform Act, where they created a Supreme Court. And we now have the government are trying to deport illegal immigrants, and they're being stopped from doing that by the Supreme Court, which is something Tony Blair created. Or the Equality Act, which has essentially embedded identity politics into our laws. I put my hands up as a new MP in 2010 as a government minister. I don't think I'd realised how much that Blairite change had made it harder for elected politicians to get things done. And of course, we made it worse in some ways. So I think establishing the Office of Budget Responsibility was a massive mistake.
Shifting power away from the Chancellor to the Resolution Foundation.
Essentially, yes. You have people who used to work at a left-wing economic think tank now deciding how much money the Chancellor has for tax cuts or spending or whatever.
But you know more than anyone that trying to, I was going to use a ruder word there, but I'll say mess with things like the OBR and the sort of normal way of doing things, the
status quo.
The status quo ends in tears pretty quickly. So,
well, it did end in tears for me. That's certainly true.
Yeah, so how's anyone... It doesn't look like Keir Starmer, who's looking likely to be the next Prime Minister, is going to change any of this. If anything,
no, he would make it worse. He has actually said on the record he's going to make it worse. So he has said...
So what's the plan?
That all the things that aren't working in Britain, he's going to turbocharge them. So that is not a recipe for success.
10 years to save the country.
Does not involve Keir Starmer. It's not just about the United Kingdom, because we've also seen the same tendencies in the US. So let's take one issue, which is the use of hormone blockers for the under 18s, the gender ideology. That is something that no person or very few members of the public actually support. But it's being promulgated in our schools, the idea there are 100 genders. Young teenagers have been encouraged to take puberty blockers.
The results of the
and the same thing has happened in the United States as well. So this isn't just a British phenomenon. What we're seeing across the West is people who aren't elected, but who have an agenda, are changing our societies in ways that people don't want to see. So saving the West is not just about what happens in Britain, it's also about what happens in the United States. And it's about Conservatives actually fighting back against left-wing ideology, because we've allowed the left to win in many areas. And I mentioned one, which is this gender ideology, but it's also true on things like the net zero agenda. It's true on human rights and immigration.
You sat in a cabinet.
I sat in a cabinet for many years.
You sat in a cabinet
time.
that signed off the net zero agenda without a price tag on it, and it was plucked off the shelf by a prime minister on the way out looking for a legacy. And Philip Hammond, your old mate, says it had a £1 trillion bill that no one's talked about. So,
well, on that one point, I agree with Philip Hammond, which is that was a mistake. It was a mistake retaining the Climate Change Act that Labour put in and the Climate Change Committee. And essentially, we have kowtowed to the left. There were Conservative cabinet ministers.
So you spent time in cabinet kowtowing to the left?
I spent time fighting, and you will read in every detail of all the battles I had in my book.
We've got to update the paperback of our version, so I'm looking forward to it.
Including a chapter called A Hostile Environment, where I talk exactly about these battles that we were having with the environmentalists on the left. And I think too many Conservatives went along with these arguments rather than fighting them.
It just does seem a little bit... there's a bit of a disconnect between your 14-year career in Parliament so far and, suddenly now, once it's all gone a bit south, saying, well, it's all the fault of this shadowy conspiracy of Quaggo
That's not what the book says. I'm very clear that, first of all, when I went into government, I was more optimistic about trying to change things within the system.
And you had it
beaten
out of you.
I had it beaten out of me. And the more senior I got, the harder I realised it was.
We'll talk about...
And, particularly my experience in the Ministry of Justice, where I was beaten around the head by the judiciary, wasn't learning...
fight with them, though, didn't you?
I picked a fight with them because they were doing things that I felt were not right. And I felt the judiciary was not accountable enough, in the same way as I feel that the economic establishment is not accountable enough for what they do. So I am somebody who is prepared to take on the status quo. Has it always gone perfectly? No, it hasn't. And I'm totally honest about that in my book. But my point is, unless we do that, unless we are prepared to take this stuff on, we will find it very, very hard to implement Conservative policies. And I have lots of people say to me, why is it, Liz, that we have had a Conservative government in power for 14 years, and yet, we haven't stopped illegal immigration. We haven't dealt with the issues of transgender. I think one part of it is Conservatives not being prepared to fight the left enough and essentially meeting them halfway. And part of it is that the bureaucracy is much more powerful than it used to be. And there's no doubt about that, that if governments in the 70s and 80s had faced the same type of bureaucratic constraint and legal constraint as we do now, they would not be able to have got the things done they did. What
would you do differently if you had it all over again? And we'll talk about the future in a minute, but if you had it all over again, what would you have done differently as a minister? Apart from take the Queen's advice and slow down a bit.
Well, I think the big issue around the mini budget, which I still believe was right. I believe if the mini budget had remained in place...
Weren't you trying to do 5 years' worth of economic reform in 15 minutes, though?
No. All I was trying to do is not raise corporation tax was the main measure in this budget.
And cut income tax, and cut national insurance and various other measures that weren't really that trailed during your campaign.
Well, in the campaign, I'd explicitly said I was going to get rid of the health and social care levy.
But you didn't say you were going to cut the top rate of corporation tax on the eve of the Labour conference, giving them the biggest.
I think you mean the top rate of
income tax. Yes.
The big issue was, once we announced the mini budget, is first of all, the governor of the Bank of England the night before announced he was selling £40 billion worth of gilts and didn't raise interest rates as much as expected. So the market was disappointed by that. But also, on the Monday, it became clear that we had a massive issue with LDI's liability-driven investments. And that was what created the really difficult scenes in the market, because those pension funds then had to try and fund cash calls. And If you ask me what, knowing what I did now, that there was this massive tinderbox. The Bank of England governor ought to have dealt with that issue.
So you blame Andrew Bailey more than your own side?
I believe that Andrew Bailey has a large share of the blame, yes.
Have you told him that?
I'm telling him that now.
Very good. Andrew Bailey, if you're listening, watching, please do join us another time. So do you
and by the way, just on this, I am constantly getting trashed in the left-wing media about, my failings. And I totally admit that I've got failings. But what scrutiny has Andrew Bailey been placed under about his role in this? What scrutiny has he been placed under about the LDI scandal, which he presided over? This guy is paid twice as much as a prime minister, much harder to sack than a prime minister, and yet the media put very little scrutiny on him.
Do you buy the idea that there was also a kind of unprecedented intervention from, some people say, the IMF, obviously sacking Tom Scholar on day one, the permanent secretary of the Treasury sort of upset that particular bit of the...
If you're not prepared to check, if you're not prepared to take people on and try and change the status quo, what's the point of being prime minister?
Some of your supporters say that Scholar had a hand in getting the IMF to publicly slag you.
Well, I've got no idea what went on behind the scenes. What I know is that we've had an economic establishment in Britain, the Treasury, the Bank of England, and more recently the OBR, that have presided over a period of stagnation. That's the result of the policies that have been pursued. And what I know from being a Treasury Minister for 2 years is the whole structure makes it very, very difficult for ministers to change those policies. And I consciously went in, and I described this in my book, I consciously went in with Kwasi Kwarteng trying to change those policies and do things differently. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for the Prime Minister and Chancellor to choose who they want running a department.
It feels like you're here to settle some scores finally. You've gone away, you've licked your wounds, you've come back, and now you're ready to start throwing some punches.
I still want to change things.
From the
That's what, not necessarily.
But I keep reading that you and Priti Patel are forming a dream team where she'll be leader of the opposition and he'll be the shadow chancellor. Is that?
I don't have any sort of preconceptions about what I'm going to do in the future. I'm not looking beyond the next 10 months.
You're not ruling it out.
I don't rule anything out. Why rule anything out?
You would see a return to... You'd like to see a return.
It's not top of my list of things to do.
Not top of your list.
It wasn't an entirely painless experience, to be honest, Harry. So I don't want to. I went into that job because I felt things needed to change. That people had voted for change in 2016. They'd voted for change in 2019. I wanted to deliver that. Frankly, I did not have enough support from either the Conservative Parliamentary Party, and I had a lot of resistance from the establishment in trying to enact those policies. What I now see, and this is why I use the phrase bigger bazooka, is that we need a much more powerful coalition of people who are ready to actually try and achieve that change.
That presumably doesn't, that includes factors, forces outside of the Conservative Party. Last time I saw you, you were having a very nice time at Nigel Farage's birthday.
I think you were as well, Harry.
I think everyone had a nice time. The right is splintered in this country. You're looking at a Keir Starmer premiership by hook or by crook, whether it's a massive majority or a majority, if the polls would be believed. How are you going to bring that together? If you say that, this big bazooka, that's going to need Nigel Farage in that, isn't it?
But the core thing has to be, what platform are we actually fighting on as Conservatives? That's the core thing I'm trying to address in my book. And what I'm trying to say is it's not enough just to have the right policies on tax or the right policies on immigration or the right policies on, taking on wokery. We're going to have to actually change the way British government works if we're going to deliver Conservative policies, because there has been a takeover of our institutions by the left. That is the reality of the situation. And that is what I'm trying to say to everybody who's involved in politics. By the way, I would like Nigel Farage to join the Conservative Party. I think the Conservative Party is the party that can do this. We just need to be a lot more honest with the public about what the problems we face as a country are. And we need to be a lot clearer about the solutions. And if there's one lesson from what I tried to do, I tried to do that with very little preparation time, with only 2 years to go to a general election. And what I now realise is the forces aligned against me were so powerful that you need more of a run-up.
So about
you need more of
10 years, you'd say.
Well, and I'm not just talking about the UK, I'm talking about what's happening in the US as well. What I fear is if we don't get our act together as the West, we will see the likes of China, Russia and Iran dominating the world. The biggest fear I have is US losing reserve currency status and what that would mean. I think if the West doesn't start growing economically, defending itself better and projecting itself more strongly in the world, I think we'll really struggle.
Do you think Rishi Sunak gets that? He's currently fighting calls to increase defence spending. He sat in that chair exactly where you were not long ago and said that he would countenance leaving the ECHR. Is that something you would do? Do you think he's doing enough?
I think we need to leave the ECHR, but I don't...
With or without a referendum? No more referendums, please.
No more referendum. I agree with you.
But you'd need a massive mandate from the people to do that.
You would, but it's not enough just to leave the ECHR.
What else do you need to leave?
We've got to abolish the Supreme Court.
Bring it back into the Lords, or...?
Yes. Bring it back into the Lords.
I presume the OBR is pretty high on your hit list as well.
That's definitely... Although, and what the OBR do with their modelling is they actually encourage governments to have higher immigration.
Yeah.
Because they essentially try and force governments to trade off tax cuts for immigration rises. But the other thing, we've got to leave the ECHR, abolish the Supreme Court and abolish the Human Rights Act.
So to strip it back out.
Yeah. So,
and the British Bill of Rights? I think the Tories tried to do that 3 or 4 times in the last...
I prefer the traditional Bill of Rights. That it's always... I mean, Britons have been free for many, many years. The idea that human rights were only invented in 1997 is a Blair fiction.
All
that he's invented is rights for people that shouldn't be in our country.
One of the sort of most totemic moments where the public can see Britain coming up against the ECHR, grounding of flights of Rwanda, big issue this week. What is is that a policy you think is ever going to get off the ground, ever going to work? Would you have kept it if you'd been in power?
I believe it's a good policy. I think we should expand it to more countries rather than solely Rwanda. But it's fundamentally a good policy. It's based on the policies the Australians use to deter illegal immigrants. The problem is it's being blocked by the courts. That is the problem. This is what I'm saying, that we don't have a judiciary that is sufficiently accountable. And so, a bit like when we left the EU, but still ended up with...
I think it's a good idea, because you were never a Remainer, but then I remember talking to you in the past about how you never really considered it to be a top 10 issue facing Britain. The overregulation and taxation of this country is done domestically rather than from the EU. Do you think it's been worth all the pain and hassle?
I think it is a good thing that we've left the EU, but the problem is we've still got all the EU laws on our statute books, and the EU mentality is still there.
And you'd link that back to the bureaucracy, or is that a Rishi thing? Is that a deep state thing? Or?
It's to do with the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy still operates as if we were in the EU.
Do you have?
This is why I do think, and so do the courts.
Do you have any sympathy with your successor, Rishi Sunak? Do you think he's similarly bound by a disruptive party from the other side, not the side that got rid of you, but the side that that support you? Do you think he's equally sort of cuffed in this mess that you set out?
If we go back to 2022 and the leadership election, my analysis of the situation was the status quo was not delivering, and that if we wanted economic growth, if we wanted to be able to face the electorate with the situation having improved, we needed to change things. His analysis was more status quo based.
And you think has that changed in office?
He was the Chancellor that increased corporation tax.
Has that changed in office, though? You're a serving Tory MP. Do you think he has done enough to turn things around?
Well, what I would observe is that, we need to do more. We need to do more. That is why I'm saying that I think the arguments I made back in 2022 about needing to take on the economic establishment needing to take on the orthodoxy are still true. And the fact people voted for change, we haven't delivered enough change. And that is partly because there's not enough support for it on the Conservative benches. And I want to see more support for change.
But this is going to take longer. This is going to take decades. You know, you're facing 5 years potentially of Keir Starmer, maybe 10. He's asking for a decade of renewal. By the time, how are you going to do this? It's going to be too late. Surely, the Tories going down the Swanee is...
The first thing is,
that's it.
Is convincing sceptical people, such as you, Harry,
naturally sceptic,
that we have a problem.
Don't believe me. I can see the problems.
So
I'm just not sure what the solution is.
Well, the solution, part of the problem is all of this Blairite inheritance we didn't get rid of. We didn't deal with the Equality Act, the Climate Change Act, the Human Rights Act, the Constitutional Reform Act. It is now holding us back from implementing Conservative policies. So one of the things I say in my book is we've got to repeal that.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure you would necessarily agree with that.
I'll have to read the book. But just...
Excellent. I hope that's an endorsement.
The Tories lose the election. Do you feel any responsibility for the result that's clearly coming down the track for the government?
Well, I mean, all of the Conservative Party who've been in power, I mean, I don't want to sort of conduct a post-mortem. I want to fight the election and do as well as we can in the election. But fundamentally, what are the issues people are facing? The issue people are facing is high cost of living, immigration, which is still a problem in terms of both legal and illegal immigration. And I would say on both of those issues, I tried to change things to make that situation better. So, I don't regret trying to do that, but the forces against me.
What do you regret?
Well, sometimes I regret running in the first place because I just think I was in a pretty impossible position trying to do that without enough support from the Conservative Parliamentary Party and with such resistance from the economic establishment. But I still believe it was the right thing for the country.
The Queen, you write in your book, said, pace yourself. Do you wish you had?
Well, I think, look, she was an extremely wise woman. And, so on the ball and so wise in what she said. I think I was in
What else did she say? Tell her.
Well, she said, she talked a lot about all of the issues that were going on, all of the issues in the PM's inbox. She was amazingly across absolutely everything that was going on. And I was just, when our meeting ended and she said, I'll see you again next week, I absolutely thought that would happen. And I was so shocked by what happened over the next
moment of national crisis, essentially, that no one really had been through it as an adult in this country, really in living memory for a vast part of the country. Do you not think that moment of upheaval would have been better to take some time to reflect on that rather than chucking a few grenades around?
It was... The difficulty was that we'd already had quite a long period of hiatus. There were a lot of issues that had mounted in the inbox over the course of the leadership election. And things like the energy prices expected to go up to £6,000. It did mean that we had to act quickly. And my view of politics, which might be different from some of my colleagues, is that people don't actually vote on the basis of what press releases the government puts out. They vote on the basis of what my energy bill is. Do I feel my life's getting better? Is my kid's school okay or not? Can I get an appointment on the NHS? And with only 2 years to go and all these very serious issues mounting up, I thought it was really important to act quickly. And I'm not convinced that having waited longer would have changed any of the fundamentals, because it wouldn't have made the Bank of England suddenly in favour of my policies or, parts of the Conservative Parliamentary Party.
Or that pension issue.
I've thought a lot about this, and nobody has yet managed to lay out to me a path where these things could have been delivered. So my general conclusion was that I was in a pretty impossible position. But, maybe the Harry Cole premiership would have been different. I don't know.
We live in hope for that. Come back, yes or no?
Well, come back on this show.
Come back on the show. But would you like to come back? Would you like to serve in office again in any capacity?
No, I don't really want to, commit to anything at this stage. What I'm focused on is talking about. I think I have got quite a unique perspective, having spent 10 years in government, having got right to the top, having had numerous battles in 6 different departments. And I want to use that learning.
I think we call that on Never Mind the Ballots, not a denial. We're out of time, but former Prime Minister, one day Prime Minister again, or Chancellor under Priti Patel, perhaps. Liz Truss, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Harry.